We're going to get this final panel going here, and a little bit of background on this panel before I turn it over to our moderator. So it says, kind of like Bill talked about real estate, it says energy panel, but that's not really what this is today. This is a story, a discussion about the transition that is going on in our country and in the world internationally as to the transition of how we access energy to drive our country, produce electricities. And what does that mean? And this is a subject that I'm pretty sure anybody that you ask, even on the Jimmy Kimmel show when they go out on, Hollywood Boulevard and ask people opinion, they'll have an opinion on this subject. What is the pace of transition of the energy infrastructure that's going on in our country? And so that's what this group's going to talk about. Historically, at this forum, we have had what I'd call kind of a traditional hydrocarbons update on energy. Last year, we added an alternatives renewable panel in addition to that. This year, we said, this is really not two panels. This is one panel working together to take us from where we are to where we're going. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our panel's moderator, and he did this last year as well. Prajit Ghosh with Wood Mackenzie. He leads their power and renewables group. Has an interesting background in that he kind of started out in the traditional hydrocarbons area and transitioned over to the renewables area at this point in his career. And the folks at Wood Mac have been great partners with us, as well as other folks up here. So I'm going to turn it over to you, to Prajit, and we're interested to see where this discussion goes.
All right. Thank you, Del, and thank you, Bill, and thanks everyone for having us here. Talking about paradigm shifts it was always a controversial issue, and especially if you're sitting in Houston and talking about paradigm shifts away from fossil fuels to renewables. So the last year we had a panel that was primarily focused on renewables, and this time we figured we'd talk of something broader about energy transitions and have a pretty esteemed panel that spans oil, gas, power, and renewables industries. But before I introduce the panel, we wanted to start with a 10-minute preamble to what this transition is, high level, and also sort of try to throw a few data points so we all sort of have a common fact base. So, but since this transition, so where's the clicker? Should know that. Oh. Hey. All right. So, but since this transition is all about moving from the fossil fuel paradigm to a renewables and electricity paradigm, I figured we'd put some slides on what oil and gas companies are doing about the energy transition, what their views are, and how they're responding to it. This is not every single oil and gas company. It is a small subsection of them. And this has really happened in the last 2 years. So I'll take the example of Dong Energy, which is a Danish oil and natural gas company, which is primarily upstream and fossil fuel based. Back in 2017, they divested from oil and gas and moved completely to renewables and electricity. And I'll let you read the quote in your time, but really what they've said is there's a foundational shift happening, and we're going to exit this oil and gas business and enter a new one. Now that is an extreme example of how an oil and gas company has transitioned to this sort of new paradigm or preparing for it. I'll just put all of them. And part of what they did was the Danish oil and natural gas company, Dong Energy, changed their name to Ørsted. Now, Ørsted was a scientist who figured out the linkage between electric currents and magnetism. So, but that's really the idea, is they're sort of entering into a pure electricity play, and that's the name. Statoil, 1 year after that, in 2018, did something similar. Now, Statoil is at their peak was $100 billion of revenues from oil and gas, and now they're trying to find a balance between their oil and gas business and investing in call it new energies, call it electricity and renewables. And again, you'll see I've put quotes from the CEOs and chairmen, and really you see a common theme, which is to prepare for the energy transition. And this is not just about Statoil's or a Danish oil and natural gas company. It's also about the oil majors like Shell and Chevron, who again are maintaining their oil and gas business, which obviously is a primary cash cow, but they're also investing in new energies quite significantly. So I wanted to set up that, and because this obviously, if oil and gas companies are doing this, then it's important to sort of ask the question: what is this energy transition? Why are these people worried about it? Why are they changing their fundamental business for it? So actually, before I get to that, so let me talk about the energy transition in 2 or 3 slides, which is obviously a challenge. The story of the energy transition is really about a lot of subsystems within the energy industry coming together. Now, some of these subsystems are largely not linked to each other. You think about the electricity sector and you think about the oil sector. These 2 sectors have no direct linkages, or historically, at least. But now they're having to think about each other's vocabulary, which is completely different. How you think about barrels of oil, it works on very different principles than how a kilowatt hour of energy works. So these industries are coming together. You're also seeing new subsystems getting introduced to the energy landscape, which is renewables or electric cars or battery storage. So what this is ultimately doing is it's changing how the energy industry works slowly but steadily. So so what we figured we would do in this panel is, because these subsystems are completely different from each other, we're trying to create this common vocabulary. So we'll talk about each subsystem separately. The first subsystem, you've probably heard about it. If you read the Shell Management Day and what they published, they said they envision a big portion of their business, 15-20%, to be power and renewables. So what is power and renewables? And really this, so think of it as a planetary system which is sort of combining 2 different worlds together. One world is this renewable technology space. So these are folks who are building solar panels and wind turbines or rooftops on buildings. Now that about 7-8 years back was that was largely the remit of venture capitalists. But now renewables have gone mainstream, and I'll put some data to show that. And as they've gone mainstream, this power and renewables system has come together. The traditional power business has now combined with the renewables business. And this system is really a driver of this energy transition, which I'll go through. Okay. So, and again, so that's the general idea of these 2 systems coming together, but just to put some data behind it. Again, the power business was traditionally coal and gas dominated. But what this chart is showing you is where the dollars are going, or the investments are happening incrementally in this power and renewable subsystem. And all you need to do is sort of look at the last 3 years, and you'll see a lot of orange and a lot of red and a little bit of gray. Those are all renewable technologies, either solar or wind or battery storage. And the green and the blues are coal and gas investments. So right now in the US, if you aggregate all the investments in this subsystem, 90% of investments in the last 3 years have gone into renewables. So this whole idea that we can argue, and there's legitimate arguments to be made as to the viability of renewables and how we can get more and more renewables in the system. But this is actual data which is showing you that 90% of the investments is happening in this space now, which is, again, a paradigm shift from what used to happen. And because we're in Houston, I figured I'd put a slide on the Texas electricity grid, what's happening in Texas. And again, it's not a whole lot different from what's happening in the US in aggregate. And what you see is, again, over time, the green is falling and the orange and the red is increasing. The green is investments in gas technologies for power generation purposes. And the yellow is wind. Obviously, if you go to West Texas, you go south of Corpus Christi, you see a lot of wind turbines. What you don't see is a lot of solar panels. And in the next few years, you'll see a lot more solar panels along with the wind turbines. That money is already being invested. So that's what's happening in sort of the power and renewable space. And what this does is, as renewables become the predominant investment, everyone starts to think about how to make it work, how to change existing rules, how to change the physical grid to make it happen because the money is flowing in that direction. So that's this subsystem. And to quickly fast forward to, I didn't want to talk about every single subsystem, so I put the whole energy, all the different parts of the energy system together. So you see power and renewables, and you see natural gas, oil, coal, metals and mining. So I mean, again, it's bigger than this, but just to sort of give you a schematic. Now, if you wanted to play out, in theory, what the aspiration is as to what this energy transition will do, again, theoretically, I just wanted to play it out. So the idea is you get more and more renewables in power generation, and then you electrify as much as you can. That is currently does not use electricity. So I'm just going to play this out. There's some graphics. So you see that the power and renewables becomes a bit bigger and greener, and the coal piece falls in size. So that's stage one of this energy transition. The next stage, which we're arguably in right now, is you take all the transport, which is obviously all the gasoline demand and the diesel demand, and you electrify those. And you're obviously increasing the size of the power and renewables sector, and you're obviously, by definition, reducing how big the oil sector is. Again, this is all theory. And finally, similarly, natural gas. You take industrial demand. You take all the heating consumption, natural gas-based furnaces that 50% of houses in Texas have, and you electrify them using heat pumps. So again, you're electrifying natural gas end uses, which are not currently electrified. So then you just see this power and renewables system becomes a much bigger piece of the energy landscape. And this is the theory. And what's left, again, aspirationally, the idea is what you can't electrify, find other avenues to change, to reduce fossil fuel use. For example, plastic bans. So you'll see these, very annoying straws, plastic straws, which are not plastic straws, paper straws that you get to use. That's a way to reduce oil consumption that cannot be electrified. So that's really the theory behind energy transition. But let me put some numbers behind it. And I'll just talk about electrification because this is sort of a predominant discussion at this point. So this is a forecast that Mackenzie did for. On the left-hand side chart, we're trying to show how many, there's 17 million cars that you sell in the US every year. And what we're trying to show in this chart is what percentage of those cars we think will be electric cars going into the future. And what we're showing you is a WoodMac forecast, but this is largely consensus view at this point. And you don't see a whole lot happening in the next 10 years. Really, the focus of this panel is 10 plus years. But post-2025, you see a pretty fast increase in the number of electric cars that are sold. So it goes from 1 in 10 cars sold in 2025 to 7 in 10 cars in the US sold in 2040. So you can see this incremental change that will happen, which is largely, again, there's a whole lot of drivers for this, which hopefully we'll get through with the panel. But what this does for oil is on the right-hand side chart, which is showing you sort of historically what the oil demand has been globally and what it's expected to do going forward. So in the last, you can see 2000 to 2017, oil demand increased by roughly 1.7, 1.8% per annum, a pretty sizable increase. And if you see the trend line, is going one direction, but our forecast is going another. And this plateauing happens at the same time when we think electric cars will become mainstream. And you see peak oil demand occurring in 2035. Again, all of this is largely consensus view coming out of British Petroleum, and statistical surveys and things like that, not just WoodMac. So again, the broader message is that you think about there's more renewables in power generation. That paradigm is already here. This paradigm is not here, but the building blocks of this paradigm on electrification is being put together. And we'll talk about all of this. And finally, the one ecosystem that's not talked about is more macro in nature as to and it goes into answering why does this energy transition, why is it going to happen? How are you so sure? And the answer is not because renewables is cheap. In fact, renewables may not be cheap, but But this is the reason why, as to why we think this transition will happen, is that the energy transition is really driven by larger macro forces. And there's really, you can bucket them into two broad forces. One is environmental concerns and sustainability, and the other is digitization. And they sort of both work in tandem and drive this energy transition. So as an example, when you go from a fossil-based to a renewables paradigm, you're not just building big solar farms to replace big gas plants or coal plants. You're also building solar panels on top of buildings. There's 115 million households in the US. A big subsection of them might have solar panels on top of them at some point. So you're looking at this sort of decentralized sources of energy now instead of a few centralized sources. To make that work, you need software and hardware technologies to work in tandem. And that's where digitization comes in. So that's just one micro example of why these two forces are coming together to make this happen. I'll end with that. Actually, I won't end with that. I will end with this slide. But when you think about this ecosystem, again, these are all, when I say these subsystems or why I use words like ecosystem, these are generally different bunch of people working with different optics of how they look at the world. Right? And they don't understand the other system. And that's what we're trying to do, is to bridge that gap. So in this ecosystem, what they look at is lines like this, which is basically global carbon emissions. And you can see there's two lines at the top, and then there's one line sort of declining. The declining line is what carbon emissions need to get to, the reduction that needs to happen to prevent climate change, according to scientists. And the other two lines are what we think is feasible at this point in time. That's our forecast. So that gap between the two lines is pretty significant. And there's no alternative. Right now, there's no feasible option to bridge these two lines. And this is where we are today in terms of the energy transition. There's a big questions being asked as to how you can fast forward this energy transition. And we'll talk about the Green New Deal, because that's really a function of this. With that, I will end, and I will introduce our esteemed panel. Actually, if you don't mind, Cody, if you just want to start.
Sure. So my name is Cody Dick. I'm an analyst and principal at Fayez, Sarofim and Company. I've covered the energy sector for 17 years now. I started out as an investment banker here in Houston. Did a little time on the sell side on integrated oils. And then at Sarofim, I've covered a variety of things, but I've covered really the oil and gas pieces of energy throughout my tenure, which I've been there now almost 15 years.
Hi, I'm Anita, Odedra. I've worked in the natural gas industry for about 20 plus years, primarily in the upstream, midstream, and currently in the downstream. I'm working for a company called Tellurian. We're a startup, $2.5 billion cap startup actually, building an LNG export terminal in the Gulf Coast. So I'll be talking a little bit about natural gas and LNG today.
RT Dukes, I've spent about 13 years on the upstream side, largely from a research perspective, but also an investment perspective. I spent a lot of time at WoodMac connecting our market views, our upstream data, what we're seeing on the ground to what our markets teams are seeing, and kind of reconcile maybe some of the technological advances on the upstream side and how low cost hydrocarbons have become, and marry that to a long-term view with demand of what really happens going forward. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of debate, so we'll probably debate a little bit today as well.
And I'm Richard Gruber. I started my career here in the natural gas industry in the pipeline side, and stayed in fossil and traditional energy for about 25 years, and made the transition to renewables in 2007 with a company called First Solar. And, we helped them develop their project development platform. So move from a module manufacturer to a power plant developer, constructor. In the last 2 years, we spun out of First Solar, started a company that answered the question, since solar is so cheap and batteries are coming fast, how can we deploy it in places that haven't adopted it? Where are those markets?
Thank you all. So, I wanted to start with just get a sense of what the industry is thinking in terms of this energy transition. Maybe I'll start with oils.
Sure.
So peak oil in 15 years. What is the oil industry at large thinking about? Where are they in terms of the energy transition?
I'd say there's a transition in the oil and gas space as well that's happening right now. I think, number one, compensation. So in Europe, European oils are compensated for climate change initiatives and whatnot, so all of a sudden they're much greener. So I think with that linked to compensation, you wouldn't see such a change, but the European oils now, as alluded to earlier, are committed to 10 to 20% of their capital going into low carbon power. Part of it is the link to the person right next to me, which is they have tremendous exposure in the major oils to the LNG business. You take the cheapest natural gas in the world, liquefy it, and try to take it to the highest paying market in the world. And with that, the integrated oils are trying to find a way to vertically integrate all the way into the power business. So that's a big piece of it. I think the second piece is a little dose of reality in that, we talk about electric cars, we talk a lot about different things, but as Americans sitting in this room, we all use 22 barrels per person per year in the United States. That's 21 million barrels a day for 330 million people. So in India and China, they're still using between 2 and 4 barrels per person per year. So if they get to using just a quarter of what we use on a per capita basis, those two countries would be using 31 million barrels a day instead of the roughly 15 or 16 that they're at presently. So that's really where the demand growth lies. And the expectation is you still have an emerging consumer around the world that wants the things that we've been privy to for the last 50 years. And so that's a trend that I think continues. I also, along those lines, I just met with Toyota this morning, and they're talking about trying to become a mobility company, but they don't know what the definition of that is really going to look like. And they're still more prone in Japan to think about fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen than they are electrics because they have to import natural gas at a price that is probably close to double digits. So maybe they're $9, $10 for natural gas, where we're at $3. So it's a challenge. And even China, they can electrify their cars. It's the biggest electric market. It's the biggest car market. But if they're putting coal in their cars, it's still a problem. So that's the reality is we're going to continue to deliver a lot of oil and gas for a long time. There will be efficiency gains that we have. There will be a lot of hybrid vehicles that are still sold. But that's where the debate lies is we know that change is coming. We know it's going to ultimately impact gasoline and diesel demand, especially for light transportation. We haven't figured out how to change that really for marine vehicles yet. LNG could be a part of that, marine vessels. But aviation, heavy transportation still needs oil and gas. So the investment that's going behind that, I think there are some different points of view. And we see some companies today that are harvesting the investments of the last decade and running more for cash flow today, with the focus on giving that back and just trying to run flat. And then I would contrast that with, say, an Exxon today, which is trying to be much more counter-cyclical under a new CEO and new regime to try to embrace that they are the most capable, most financially astute company out there. And they're putting $50 billion into an integrated investment in Texas between the Permian Basin, refining capacity, chemicals capacity, and LNG. And that's a 30-year or more bet. And so, there are a lot of different models that are happening as part of this discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Cody. And there's actually an interesting statistic I came across, your point on India and China. The China car fleet will increase by 250 million cars in the next 20 years. That's the number of cars in the US right now. That's the increase that will happen in China. And there's a big section of that, of those people who are earning less than $10,000 a year. So when you take the demographics and you take the macroeconomics, it's hard to sort of envision all of them going electric as much as the Chinese government wants to do it. But I wanted to, Anita, if I can just circle back with you in a bit, RT, on the exploration side, if you're doing exploration and you're making 20, 30-year investments, how do you think about this demand uncertainty that exists in?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and that's why you've seen a lot of investment turn to the onshore U.S., where an Exxon can invest $5 billion a year, and if it needs to, because oil prices are a little bit lower and it has good rates of return in Guyana, or it has good rates of return in a refinery or an LNG export facility, it can be a little bit more flexible with those dollars. I do think we do have a concern in terms of, and this started before the downturn, we're not discovering much oil. We've had a little success over the last year or two, Guyana being the big bright spot, the others being onshore U.S. Onshore U.S. can do so much. Maybe it's 2 or 3, maybe it's 5 years that you can meet kind of that demand growth on the oil side. But every year of low prices, we're getting a little bit better demand growth than we expected. And that kind of trickles throughout or it cascades throughout that forecast to where even that 2035 number that we see, it's really just for gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, petrochemicals. We still see demand rising post that 2040. So you really need some big technological innovations to even change that. So demand looking relatively strong with an industry, Euro majors already mentioned, really shifting to more of a natural gas focus. Now, where's the oil going to come from? You've got to begin sanctioning some of these longer lead time projects. And we don't really see the industry as a whole transforming or transitioning to being more like the onshore U.S., where it's smaller investment decisions, it's less integrated investment decisions, which really just means they're cheaper. It's a competitive market at every stage within the value chain that allows you to make decisions faster and more cheaply than you can elsewhere. It likely points to some higher oil price longer term, unless this unconventionals world just gets bigger and bigger. Maybe some of these other countries figure out fiscal terms and maybe can incentivize a supply chain to actually develop them. Without that, you get to a few years down the road and you kind of say, well, where's the next big oil supply source? So you can look at that a couple ways. One, we could continue to see technological innovation in unconventionals, or you don't get it and you get a higher oil price that maybe helps push some of this transition that Prajit's talking about as well.
Okay, thanks. Anita, gas as a transition fuel is a widely quoted term. You could add some perspective on how the gas industry is thinking about transition and the role of gas.
So I think generally the gas industry has embraced that term, but I don't think they think of it as a transition fuel, as in that it will actually transition to renewables 100%. I think their view is that gas will be a partner to renewables. In the beginning, certainly we will be adopting techniques that allow renewables into the space, but ultimately we don't see 100% renewable being a viable solution. And I think even your chart where you showed, the CO2 requirements and the gap between what the scientists think should happen and what's actually reality plays to that point. Mm-hmm. And if there's no technological advancements that allow renewables to take up that 100% space, even the International Panel for Climate Change is saying that natural gas will be an important part of the energy mix through 2050, 50, and beyond. So I think that a transition fuel is a coined term because we're talking about an energy transition, which everyone tends to believe in, but I think we prefer to use the partner term, an energy partner.
Okay. Just one follow-up question to that. So there's, obviously gas is a big piece to this in terms of cleaning up carbon emissions. There's some chatter about methane leaks and questions around how clean it really is. Can you comment on that, what the issue is and what?
So I think it's a little bit of a red herring, and I think it's something that's just, often thrown at gas executives just to make them squirm a little bit. Ultimately, methane leaks are basically leaks in infrastructure that is an engineering solution. There are leaks from old equipment, which you can find an engineering solution to fix those leaks. It takes money, it takes time. ExxonMobil, the largest producer in the United States, by 2020 is replacing some of their older infrastructure, and they are saying they can reduce their methane leaks by 15%. But if we look at methane leaks, the analysis in the US, let's talk about methane leaks in the US, for example, if you look at what the EPA is publishing, and if you don't even believe the EPA, and you look at what NGOs are publishing, so NGOs are going to be much more conservative than the EPA, and then you look at what would be parity to coal, we're nowhere near that. So there's no way that methane can be seen as dirtier than coal. And then when you take into consideration particulates, NOx, SOx, and all the other stuff that isn't good for human health, ultimately gas is simply cleaner, and I don't think there's any argument about that.
And I agree. So just wanted to. Okay. Richard, obviously power and renewables is claimed to be this transition engine. How is, and that's really two different systems, the power system and the renewables folks, and how do they acknowledge that, that PNR will drive this energy transition? What's the thinking in your industry?
I don't know that it drives it. I think it's the technological advancement and the cost reduction that's happened from scale and improvements in the technology. And there were three waves, basically. The first was policy-driven, and if you think about Japan, Germany, and California as its own country, right? They had policies that said, I don't care about the costs, we're going to go do this. Those are important for these industries because it helped the wind industry and the solar industry scale their platforms and their manufacturing and improve and attract capital. First Solar attracted capital from a family office. The Walton family put $180 million into it before they did an IPO, and then it was worth about $8 billion. So it was a pretty good investment, but it was a pretty risky investment too, when they did it. The second wave was more policy and economics. I think Texas and ERCOT was a great model. There was an RPS, or Renewable Portfolio Standard. People started developing wind, not because the utilities could buy it, but because the market said it was cost effective. And they blew through the standard and just kept going. And Texas is the largest wind producer in the country, largely based on economics, gas prices at the time, and the like. And the third wave is today, and really it's cost-driven. People are doing it for cost and risk management, particularly solar, or I'll talk to solar, because it delivers power generally when demand is high and prices are high. So what happens is gas pushed off coal, because coal is not very flexible to ramp up and down. And renewables are pushing off gas peakers that don't run very many hours and aren't very efficient in the afternoon in the summer. So when you say, is it cheaper? It depends. Usually when it's sunny, the cost of capital is low or the cost of fuel is high, it's cheaper. And so it's getting its share, but like all this, it's a part of a portfolio. The thing that we saw was we looked at these wholesale markets and said, what we've learned in the last 10 years of building these solar power plants at scale, and we look at very power-dense industries, verticals. The energy industry, water industry are very power-intensive in what they consume to do what they do, right? So we said, why haven't they adopted renewables? Why haven't they looked at battery storage to harden their operations, reduce their costs, improve their environmental footprint, and maybe stave off some of the stakeholder challenges they have? And so that's what we're focused on, because we can deploy this right where they consume it, because it's very modular. So we disintermediate the wires, kind of like the cell phone did for the copper.
Okay. So. Interesting. Yeah, the one thing, just living sort of all these industries and talking to folks from across industries, what's obvious to me is, partly is everyone's sort of judging the world by their own optics. You think of the renewable subsystem 5 years back. You sort of live in that world of just climate change and renewables, and you have your views on that. So you have a very good hold over technology trends. The conventional power industry never did. But what they did understand is how the energy industry actually works. How much renewables can you have in a system? So this, as in a way, going mainstream for renewables going mainstream is a good thing in a way that the reality will, the rubber will meet the road and reality will set in across all these industries together. So this is great. So I think the segue, the takeaway from this is, oil isn't going anywhere. Gas isn't obviously not going anywhere. It's just, and renewables will grow. They're all equally true, at least in the next 20, 30 years. This is certainly not something that will happen over 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, at least given what we know. So that's where the industry stands, and it's good to know that everyone sort of acknowledges that this transition is happening, nevertheless. But let's talk through some of the, I wanted to talk to some of the new paradigms, so I wanted to throw these, as I've had conversations about this, there's all this sort of existing wisdom that people throw, and I just wanted to test it with this audience because obviously are experts in this field. So Richard, and I'll open this up to the panel after Richard, is on the cost of technologies. Solar and wind are expensive alternatives and are driven by subsidies. Fact or fiction?
It's fiction today. If you're informed as to where costs are today and where they're headed, and how you're deploying it. So if you put it in Maine, it's very expensive because it's not sunny. So you invest the same capital and you get not much power. So it depends on what you want to advocate, and what position you want to take.
Okay.
I think the paradigm, I will say, is that people are thinking of these solutions for these more modular generation solutions, and they're looking at the grid not the way we did 100 years ago. Then you said, I'll build power plants, centralized, build wires to serve everybody. This technology is giving consumers a chance to build it out from the grid or the demand point back, which means I might have fewer wires or I might need fewer upgrades. Storage is going to play a big role in that. The projections for the cost of storage for 2035 by experts about 5 to 8 years ago were hit in 2018. So it's happening very, very fast in terms of the storage front. But it too has its hair. There's evolution and development of the technologies, but it's not without its own environmental issues. Get those precious metals and recycle it and all the rest. So, I have the benefit of walking into places that are in the oil and gas complex and saying, don't shoot me, I come from your space. I'm really here to help. I'm not from California. I'm from Texas. From Houston, in fact. So that disclaimer helps, at least for the first 5 minutes.
Yep. One interesting takeaway, I think, is that because this whole industry landscape is changing, and the way you think about this is also changing. One instance, I was showing that last graphic where, and I want to know if the panel agrees with this. Please disagree if you do. Is that we all looked at markets. We looked at market trends and competitive markets and how different fuels would compete. This is a new world where you don't separate the markets from the movement. They are one and the same. And as an example, what I've seen is when there is a technology that will help, that can potentially help to achieve broader objectives, the money will follow it, and it will get done quicker than you think. I don't know, is that a fair assessment of which world we're living in now and how it's different from before? Just open it up. Cody, what do you think? Is that fair assessment of industry today?
Well, I think that is the case. For me covering oil and gas, I didn't know much about power. I'm having to learn about power because covering the European oils. And if that's where the market is going to head, the ultimate aim of these companies is to deliver energy to people that need it and want it. And so if that's where the direction is going to head, the capital is going to flow there. If that's what the demand pool is going to be. So I see more of that, of how do you take LNG and you get it to a market that can make it a fuel that can be distributed maybe in a different style of power grid than maybe what we were accustomed to in the United States or elsewhere. People still want to get the lights on and do more than, we think about Africa and solar panels, how that could change. But for the most part, that's running lights. That's not running a whole household. And so there needs to be a lot of technology that's driven into that space, the capital. Otherwise, for the oil companies in general, I see more on the chemical side than in the past as well. And that's also a view of how can we take advantage of low-cost natural gas in the U.S., where we have a massive cost advantage over the rest of the world, and then deliver products, export them to the world at this cost advantage in a growing market where people are wanting to consume more over time. So the investment behind chemicals has really come along in the last 5 years and looks like it's going to continue for at least the next 5 to 10. And that's kind of an unexpected zig in terms of what you might have thought capital-wise 10 years ago. I want to leave more of the gas discussion to Anita, but if I was sitting on this panel in 2006, we would have been talking about importing gas, and gas would have been $8. So the market changes pretty quickly, and I think that the companies have to adapt, and it's crazy to think that the market won't change again in another 10 years.
Absolutely. I mean, like you said, in the last decade, the U.S. natural gas infrastructure has moved from importing natural gas to exporting natural gas and actually exporting crude oil as well. And it's interesting that earlier I heard that the real estate business is cyclical. The gas business is very, very cyclical. Over the last couple of years, there's been a massive lack of infrastructure spend in terms of the pipelines being built in the US. There's simply not enough pipeline infrastructure to bring enough gas to the Gulf Coast for the exports that are being expected. And that's one of the things that a lot of money is going to go into over the next few years. A pipeline from the Permian to Texas will cost about $4 billion, but it will be built because it's required. So I think that the most interesting announcements in the gas industry recently have been the Shell announcement of their FID in Canada. This is the first time a massive LNG project has been announced without any end customers. Shell have such a belief in the natural gas industry that 2 years ago they did a $70 billion acquisition of BG Group, which is where I used to work, and then subsequently just at the end of last year they made the announcement that they're going to build a $30+ billion export facility of natural gas in Canada, and they don't have downstream customers because they believe they can use that gas within their own portfolio, or they will be able to monetize it with customers later. That's pretty amazing. ExxonMobil just did the same thing here in the Gulf Coast with their terminal at Golden Pass. Total made an announcement recently that they're getting into a kind of joint venture with Sempra to export natural gas from, again, the Gulf Coast and Mexico. So the U.S. natural gas industry, the shale gas revolution, has completely reshaped how some of these oil and gas majors are doing business. And LNG and natural gas is their pivot, and that's part of their energy transition. And it's certainly going to be a huge part of their portfolio going forward.
Artie, I'll segue into another paradigm. So electric cars are like golf carts. True or false? Fact or fiction? Have you driven one?
Driven a lot of golf carts, but no, I have. I'll make a different argument. I think the car manufacturers have gotten so efficient at building very specific cars that we got to a point, and I should maybe put that another way, very specific drivetrains, where we got to a point where a company like Tesla could get very quick market penetration because they offered something different. I still think we're in a stage where they offer a car that's a competitor to a very nice BMW or Mercedes. They don't yet compete with a Camry or a commuter car in terms of cost, and they're not really that close yet. Can they get there? They think so, potentially, and a lot of the numbers, battery costs tend to point to they'll eventually get there, but you've got to get a battery cost pretty low. I think it probably plays into, and I've always thought, I'm from East Texas, so a natural gas-rich portion of the U.S., and I've always wondered, why haven't we developed, regionally, why don't we have different types of cars more regionally from a demand perspective? So in East Texas, natural gas, why are you not consuming you're exporting a lot of natural gas to other parts of the U.S., why are you not using natural gas? So I think CNG, somewhere like East Texas or West Texas, where we have a lot of stranded gas, makes a lot of sense. So maybe CNG can play a bigger role as well. I think somewhere like California, where air quality is a very big issue, or urban areas, maybe EVs play a bigger part. Maybe they're your Sunday car. Maybe they fit in your portfolio of vehicles. They probably make sense in a lot of ways, and there's probably a pretty big market for them no matter how you cut it. The question becomes, can you have an EV in Chicago during the polar vortex? We've got to come up with some better advancements in technology, otherwise you're sitting stranded. And the ways we save battery life is by turning off the heater. Well, that doesn't really work in a polar vortex. So there are going to be areas where I think maybe regionally, I think we'll find that make a lot of sense in some areas. And I'm no EV expert. This is really my personal opinion. Prajit's the person to talk to about EVs. But the way I see it playing out practically is something like that is probably the answer, if you don't have some broad brush policy that forces it.
For complete disclosure, we work in the same company, and I'm not a tree hugger, but I can certainly hug EVs, and so we might differ on that. But one of the points you made was, for it to be much bigger, for all these forecasts to pan out, it really boils down to the cost of batteries. Richard, how do you see battery costs that go into electric cars? When does it get to a point where electric cars start becoming mainstream? And what are the risks around it?
I'm like RT. I'm not a
Oh.
guru on the chemistry of
Okay.
where the technology will go. I'm just watching the cost curve, right, and saying the curve's in a trajectory. The capital's going there. The innovation continues to be on a similar path what solar panels did, just about 5 years behind it. And so if I want to follow that curve, not that it will be exactly the same, it's not going to stop. I mean, the innovation, I think they're not saying that we're hitting a flattening of the curve just yet at all. So I think you watch the capital flows and you watch the innovation, as folks talked about, at universities and research, and you say, it's going to continue to come. It's just a matter of when it hits that tipping point that you talk about.
Cody, you're obviously the mobility expert here, so I should ask you, electric cars, what's your...
Well, I think let's put it in big picture perspective. So in 2006 or 7, the U.S., we were at our worst possible point. So we were using 21 million barrels a day of oil. We were importing 14 million barrels of that. And so at that point, we did things like put corn in our cars. So 40% of our corn crop is turned into 1 million barrels a day of our fuel supply. We got a lot more efficient with cars. You saw the first hybrids really hit the U.S. But during that stretch, in 11, 12 years, we've been able to cut our imports of crude oil almost to nil. But certainly, we've cut it by 1 million barrels a day per year over that time horizon. Well, what's happened, and if you went to that same time frame, China used to produce 4 million barrels a day of oil and consume 4 million barrels a day of oil. So today, they consume 12 million barrels a day of oil, and they still produce 4 million barrels a day of oil. So our problem a decade ago is now their problem. And so when you think about things like EVs, my view on the whole big picture is the world has to do things that enables the emerging economies to continue to grow. And so we've had 20 years of flat oil demand for the US, Europe, and Japan. All of the growth in oil demand has been the developing world. And that's going to continue if those stats that I gave you about China and India, if those play out, those are going to continue. So the Western world, the higher GDP per capita countries are going to have to find ways to be more efficient, to let the world grow, and to have a prosperous global GDP growth and backdrop. And so EVs, to me, are one way to do that. Over time, that frees up resources for the developing world, and 5 billion people coming into a bigger economy over time, and more wealth and higher wages to participate and grow. So that, I think if you just sit back and you think about it big picture, that's why EVs are important. And it's just a continued evolution of what the Western world has been doing for the last 20 years. We just have to find ways to get more efficient so that the world's resources go to the larger populations that are growing.
Richard?
I was just going to say one of the thoughts about EVs that people talk about too, the interconnectedness of it back with stationary power sources and power demand. So if I charge it at night when the wind and power is driving power costs down, right, at my home, I drive it to the office and I know what my return trip is. So I have controls now in my car that can say, discharge me if the price is right, up to 50% of the charge is in my battery. So all of a sudden, it doesn't matter if you have 100 cars, 1,000 cars, but put 100,000 cars with their storage device, or 1 million cars with their storage device, and say, those are available to the grid if the price is right in the afternoon in August. Because it drops the demand on the grid, which sets the marginal price, so it actually helps the price of power for everyone. And you start seeing that there's this interconnectedness that says, hey, and the controls are there. It's not, when we talk about digitization and the market economy, the ways to clear that transaction, they're there. So it's not like it's a big leap. And if I thought of something that might happen in the next 10 years that might outstrip what we would think today, it's the acceleration of that and then the monetization of that mobile storage device back into the power grid. That wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, and so we got some more ground to cover, so if I can ask just quick 30-second answers on the next few ones. There's a question from the audience. I think, Cody, you're the right one to do this. Isn't the vehicle industry ripe for disruption similar to other industries because ride sharing becomes true car sharing with people no longer owning cars, which is a fundamental paradigm shift. The question is, how will this affect U.S. consumption? Ride sharing, autonomous driving.
Yeah, so 30-second answer is yes, it's ripe for disruption. A lot of things are going to happen. I think it's soup to nuts. I mean, even hearing the real estate discussion earlier about brokerage commissions and whatnot, to our auto dealer friends in the room, I'm sorry, but like the business is going to change. Tesla and the ability to buy a car direct is going to affect that business model over time. But the point is that you still need dealers, you still need service, you still need points of supply if we don't own them, if we rent them, however that looks. It's just that the model is going to evolve. So there is a lot of disruption. How it affects demand is a question. In some view, everybody's still got to get to where they go. Unless we're riding together, we're not cutting the demand. The cars are just running all day. So we'd have to have more efficient vehicles to really cut that demand. So there's a lot of questions.
Yep. I will mention on the ride sharing, once you have autonomous cars, the theory is at least, and I'm happy to discuss offline, is that a ride sharing car would go 5 times the distance as a regular car. So if you stop owning a car and you're doing these ride sharing apps and via autonomous cars, call them robo taxis, which go from point A to point B, you basically get rid of 5 cars and you put 1 autonomous car. It's basically the same. What that basically means from an oil demand standpoint, that has an exponential impact on how fast oil demand destruction will happen. That's why you see a lot of these curves, EV curves, sort of follow this exponential increase. So happy to talk about it more. I did want to segue to this whole theme around the pressure to accelerate this energy transition. And the Green New Deal. Now, last time I talked about the Green New Deal, I got almost close to violent. So there's a glass ceiling here. So if you want to throw something, it's not going to hit them. But the Green New Deal is, obviously, the aspiration is 100% renewables within 10 years, and a lot of acceleration of mobility trends. So I just wanted to, maybe start from left to right, Cody, Anita, and RT and Richard. Green New Deal, feasibility and risks of a faster transition.
Not very feasible, but the risk of a faster transition is there. And I'd just say, I kind of led with the European oils are being compensated differently to try to meet some of these climate change initiative goals. And if we want to align our incentives in that direction, behavior changes. So.
I couldn't agree more. Very aspirational. I mean, it says very good things. Ultimately, the incentives have to be there, whether it's carbon taxes, whether it's executives' pay linked to CO2 reductions like Shell has done. There's a whole bunch of things that need to happen legislatively, regulatory, that can assist it. Other countries have done it quickly, but globally, it's just a bit harder.
You're a fan of the Green New Deal, right? You told me.
Big fan. I think it's a continuation of the kind of shock and awe on the other side. I think it's what you get. You kind of shoot for the stars and at least you get to the moon. I think that's kind of Cody's, it maybe speeds up the energy transition. And I think there's some honesty in some of the people that helped author it as well, and that we're just starting the discussion. Yep. It's starting the discussion. I think it just reinforces the fact that we work in an industry in oil and gas that is very bad at promoting itself and educating people around what it does. the energy density in gasoline. I mean, I can fill up my car in 4 minutes. You know, I've timed it one day just because I was thinking about an EV and just went, you know, how long do I waste a lot of time? You know, you hear you're wasting so much time at gas pumps and things like that. You can just do it at home. And pulled up, got out of my car, got back in, and it was 4 minutes. And I kind of went, 4 minutes, and I got a 79-cent 32-ounce Dr. Pepper from Buc-ee's, you know, while I was waiting that 4 minutes, you know. I mean, it's pretty convenient experience, you know, that's a part of our lives, kind of ingrained in our driving culture in the U.S., but we're very bad at explaining that. I just think it's one more reminder that the industry has to figure out at some point how to go on the offensive in terms of all the positive that it does. You know, I'm no spokesperson for the industry at all, but, you know, I'm looking at energy equivalents and kilowatt hour equivalents and so forth. And, you know, you can only it doesn't matter how big and how fast you can hypothetically charge the battery. You still have to find the energy that's on the grid to get it into the car that fast. Your house probably peaks out at about 40 kilowatt. A 200 amp service is about 40 kilowatt hours. So, you know, 100 kilowatt battery, hypothetically, you can only charge it on a 200 amp service in 2.5 hours. Today, your current house. So, you know, the technology has to go a long way. I just think we're bad at selling, you know, the benefits of many of the oil and gas industry, and that's probably what the Green New Deal reinforced the most in my mind.
Okay. I wanted to come back to Anita, but Richard, comments on the Green New Deal.
You know, I like where we are with the phase out of the investment tax credit, phase down. You know, we thought about, hey, you put the stimulus in to help spur some growth and let it scale. And then we got the cost reduction we wanted. So we've got a phase down now that takes it back down to 10%, like any other investment. I think it can stand on its own at that point. And there's a time when you say, if it can't, what's wrong with the policy or the theory, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm with Anita. I think, you know, and James A. Baker and a couple of other folks, right, have put forth the carbon dividend or whatever. If you want to drive it faster, let the market do it, give it some incentive, price it, right, let it be traded, and let that flow to where it wants to flow. Those that want to invest in that faster can pay for it. Others that, you know, don't, won't. But it's always worked much better than a policy directive to tell people what they should do, where they should do it, and how fast they should do it, because that really creates terrible consequences most times. I would not want to be buying electricity in Germany, because they paid for a lot of high-priced modules in a place that's not very sunny. But they did enable California to do it a little cheaper, and Texas to do it much cheaper than they did. So,
Anita, the one thing, we talked about electrification of cars, but a big part of the Green New Deal is to, within a short period of time, relatively, is to take every single building and convert the heating, you know, gas-based furnaces to electric. How feasible is that?
Well, look, it's just infrastructure, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of moving parts. So it's aspirational, and ultimately it will work if the market allows it to work. So I'm not an expert on how to change, you know, pumps out and things like that, but what I do know is that when you electrify things, you still need to have power generation to make that electricity. And where's that going to come from? It can't all come 100% from renewables. I think the Green New Deal is aspirational. I think it's a beginning of a conversation, but I do think that we all need to partner to make energy available to everybody. Otherwise, you know, we end up with a lot of other risks that we don't want.
And
I want to jump in there. You know, and I want to reiterate, I'm not I drive an EV. I'm an accounting and finance guy, and I just haven't figured out how to make my car make money, and so I generally commute. I drive 70 miles a day, so I drive a cheap car. So I haven't been able to afford those nice EVs or rationalize buying one of those nice EVs to drive to work and back every day, and also my kids destroy it on the way to sporting events. But I do have an all-electric house, and we've got a long ways to go in electric heat to make it comparable to natural gas heating. If you like being cold in the winter, we complement our electric heat with a wood-burning stove in my house. So, you know, if you want to take a step back, you know, go ahead and move your house to electric heat. And then your wife and kids are complaining about how cold it is. So you know, we have a long ways to go when it comes to electrifying everything, and especially heating. You know, I have electric water heaters. The same thing. I'm spending a lot more money heating water, about $600 a year per water heater.
Yep.
So I spend about $1,200 a year heating water, where when I had natural gas water heaters, I spent about $150 a year.
Okay.
You know, big difference. I mean, so a long ways to go before you can electrify everything.
Prajit, I have an idea, though. If you took one of those big gas pipelines going from the Permian to the Gulf, and instead of stripping off the fuel off the pipeline, their fuel is about 3% of the capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you did use wind at night off the grid and solar locally at the compressor stations, and a little battery storage, we have 3% more fuel to export, convert to LNG, or we could get some heat to this guy's house.
That's right.
That's great. That is a okay. I think we're out of time, but just if I can ask 15 seconds on any last thoughts, just anyone in the panel. Anything you would like the audience to take away?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is capital markets. So I'm thankful that we're, at least as an investor that looks at energy companies, our firm, we look at everything. So we're not energy only. We're high quality companies. They care about cash flow. The capital market constraints that have come to the energy sector are forcing the companies to think about generating real cash and real returns. And you're coming off a point where they're at their lowest weight in the S&P in a few decades. So as an investor that may have been scared off from energy the last few years, it's probably more ripe for the picking today than it's been in a long time.
Anita.
Like I said, the U.S. shale gas revolution has really, really dramatically changed what's happening in the LNG industry, and investment in U.S. LNG export projects is I think, you know, a really good place to place money and invest and be linked to global gas markets, because this is a growing industry, and gas isn't going away anytime soon.
Prajit, you'd like to share a slide. Is it solar cost or battery cost forecast from 2011?
No, it's batteries.
Battery cost. It showed battery costs falling, but not nearly getting to where it actually is today. That same organization had a forecast for tight oil from the U.S. That was falling as well. As you might know, U.S. oil production's grown about 7 million barrels per day over the last 7 years. So technological innovation impacts all of these sources of energy, especially in an industry like oil and gas, where we use a lot of remote power, where we use a lot of high-cost power as well. The argument for the energy transition might not be much of a transition. It might be an argument for low-cost energy.
Richard?
And you know, just to that point our team made, you know, it's the integration. When folks that are in traditional energy field start looking at their own energy costs and supply chain, say, you know what, I need to start deploying that, but just because it's good economics. And that's what we're seeing and what we're doing, and saying, man, there is a multi-billion-dollar capital deployment play within the space that should be savvy about energy, but has said, hey, I'm busy on my core business. Too busy to pay attention to $150 million operating cost savings, which is what we saw for 20-year life for 800 barrel crude pipeline. But we got their attention with 155 million 20-year play, because we said your shareholders are your energy suppliers,
okay,
electric suppliers. And so it's starting to crack, it's starting to happen. But it's a cultural lift, I will tell you.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you, panel members. Hopefully it helped, and obviously we being in Houston, this all has a whole different meaning. But I'm sure the panelists are around for a little bit for questions. But thank you very much, and thank you for sitting there.
100% electric house. Amazing.
I mean, it's not by design, but yeah, it's an older house. It was built in '71.
Thank you, sir. Prajit. All right. So it's been a long day. It's been a good day. I'll be brief. Just some closing remarks here. Jen, you can go ahead and open up the doors. Just want to say thank you to all our panelists and speakers today. It was one last hand. I think they did a damn good job. So, you know, Want to thank all of our organizer firms. This wouldn't happen without everybody's involvement around that. I got to do some house cleaning that's important. I need to say thank you to my fellow directors and shareholders at PKF Texas for supporting me, putting the time and effort, and then our team. And these have been the nameless, faceless behind the scenes. I'd like to recognize them individually because, again, they've kind of worked their ass off to make this happen, and they're very selfless. And so Heather Atchison, Cindy Blanks, Siri Save, Jen Lemansky, Joseph Tran, thank y'all. Y'all have done a great job. Got here late last night, got up early this morning. Again, from inception, we have partnered with Gail Hoffer and the folks at Ellie Francisco and Company. They do a great job. If you ever need a partner for an event, I'd love to provide an introduction to them. Gail, thank you. Wonderful job. And last but not least, give us some feedback. If you need to take it with you, fax it, email it, send it back somehow. It's invaluable in this exercise to us. We really do read it and appreciate it. Stay tuned for more information in the future about next year's event. We're not quite focused on it yet, but it probably will be within 90 days. And I don't know about you, I could use a drink, so feel free to join us out here. And we're all kind of trapped because of the traffic, so thank you, everybody.